The smoke was so thick I could barely see my own hands as I carried her unconscious body down the emergency ladder. Her designer suit was singed, her perfectly styled hair now matted with soot, and she clutched a briefcase like it contained her entire world. I had no idea that the woman I was saving from the third floor of the burning downtown office complex would turn out to be the same person who had denied my insurance claim 3 months earlier. The same person whose company had refused to cover my son's medical bills when he needed them most. Sometimes fate has a twisted sense of humor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other Tuesday at Station 19. I was washing the engine truck when the alarm bells shattered the routine quiet of our firehouse. My name is Marcus Rivera, and I've been fighting fires in downtown Portland for 8 years now. At 34, I've seen enough emergencies to know when a call is going to be routine and when it's going to change lives. The moment I heard the address crackling through the radio, 1247 Morrison Street, I knew this wasn't going to be ordinary. My partner Jake was already sliding down the pole as I grabbed my gear. We'd been working together for 3 years, and he knew without asking that I was thinking about my 12-year-old son Danny, who would be getting out of school in a few hours. Every call carries the weight of coming home to him, of being the only parent he has left since his mother passed away when he was 7. The responsibility sits heavy on my shoulders every time I walk into smoke and flames, knowing that if something happens to me, Danny would have no one. Our apartment is nothing fancy, a 2-bedroom place in Southeast Portland, where Danny and I have built a life that revolves around his baseball games, homework at the kitchen table, and weekend trips to the local climbing gym. The walls are covered with his artwork from school, photos of his little league team, and a few pictures of his mom that I've kept up, because I want him to remember her smile. We survive on my firefighter salary, which means we shop at thrift stores, cook dinner together most nights, and save every penny we can for Danny's future. The medical bills from his broken arm last year nearly wiped out our savings, especially after our insurance claim was denied. Some bureaucrat at Meridian Insurance decided that the x-rays weren't necessary, that the emergency room visit was excessive, that a growing boy's broken bone wasn't worth their money. I spent weeks on the phone, filing appeals, writing letters, begging them to reconsider. The rejection letter came on official letterhead, signed by someone named Victoria Chen, claims director, whose signature looked like it had been stamped rather than written by a human hand. That morning, as we raced through Portland traffic with sirens wailing, I had no idea that Victoria Chen was about to become more than just a name on a letterhead. The Morrison Building was one of those gleaming glass towers that housed the kind of businesses I never had reason to visit. Law firms, investment companies, insurance headquarters. The kind of places where people wore suits that cost more than I made in a month and made decisions that affected families like mine from behind polished mahogany desks. When we arrived, flames were shooting out of the 2nd and 3rd floor. Windows and a crowd of evacuated office workers stood on the sidewalk across the street, clutching their laptops and cell phones. Most of them looked shaken but safe, having made it down the stairwells before the fire spread. But our captain was already getting reports that someone might still be trapped on the 3rd floor, in the east wing where the flames were burning. Hottest, I volunteered to go up without hesitation, the way I always do. Jake says I have a hero complex, but the truth is simpler than that. I understand what it feels like to need help and not get it, to be forgotten by systems that are supposed to protect you. Every person I carry out of a burning building is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's entire world. They matter, because everyone should matter, regardless of what neighborhood they live in or how much money they have in their bank account. The stairwell was thick with smoke, and my breathing apparatus felt heavier than usual as I climbed toward the 3rd floor. The heat was intense, waves of it hitting me through my protective gear as I pushed open the door to the east wing. Most of the offices were empty, chairs pushed back from desks as if people had left in a hurry. But in the corner office, behind a door marked V. Chun, Claims Director, I found her. She was unconscious, slumped over her desk with that briefcase clutched in her arms like a shield. The smoke had overcome her before she could make it to the exit, and I realized she must have been trying to save files or documents instead of saving herself. Even in an emergency, some people can't let go of their work, can't prioritize their own life over their responsibilities. I scooped her up in a fireman's carry, noting how light she felt despite her professional authority, how vulnerable she looked without consciousness to maintain her composure. The trip back down the ladder with her unconscious weight in my arms felt like it took forever, each step careful and deliberate while flames lit at the windows around us. I could feel her breathing, shallow but steady, and I found myself talking to her even though she couldn't hear me. "Hang on," I kept saying. "You're going to be okay. Someone's waiting for you to come home." I always assume that someone is waiting, because the alternative is too heartbreaking to consider while you're trying to save a life. The paramedics took over the moment I reached the ground, checking her vitals and loading her onto a stretcher. She was starting to regain consciousness, coughing and disoriented, her eyes struggling to focus on the chaos around her. I watched them load her into the ambulance, just another successful rescue in what I hoped would be a routine call. I had no way of knowing that the woman I'd just saved was the same person whose signature had denied my son's medical coverage, whose decision had forced me to work overtime for months just to pay the hospital bills. It wasn't until 2 days later, when the local news ran a story about the fire, that I learned her identity. Victoria Chun, 36, single mother and claims director at Meridian Insurance, had been saved from the Morrison Building fire by Portland Fire Department. The photograph showed her in a hospital bed, looking pale but determined, giving an interview about fire safety and emergency preparedness. She looked different from the mental image I'd constructed of the heartless bureaucrat who had denied Danny's claim. More human somehow, though I couldn't shake the anger that rose in my chest when I saw her name in print. That evening, as Danny and I sat at our kitchen table working on his math homework, I found myself staring at the newspaper article. My son noticed my distraction and asked what was wrong, the way kids do when they sense their parent is troubled by something they can't quite understand. I folded the paper and put it aside, telling him it was nothing important, but the irony wasn't lost on me. I had risked my life to save the person who had made our lives harder, who had treated us like we didn't matter, who had reduced Danny's pain to a line item that could be denied with a signature. The call came 3 days later, just as I was getting ready for my shift. A woman's voice, professional but tired, asking if this was Marcus Rivera from the Portland Fire Department. When I confirmed, she identified herself as Victoria Chen, and I felt my jaw clench before she'd even finished speaking. She wanted to meet with me, she said, to thank me personally for saving her life. There was something in her voice, a quality I couldn't identify, that sounded different from the cold efficiency I'd imagined during all those phone calls about Danny's claim. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her for coffee that Saturday morning. I told myself it was curiosity, wondering what the person behind all those rejection letters would be like in person. But part of me wanted her to know who I was, wanted her to understand that the claims she denied weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, but real families dealing with real problems. I had no idea that this meeting would begin a journey that would change both of our lives in ways neither of us could have predicted. The coffee shop she chose was in the Pearl District, one of those places where a simple latte costs more than Danny and I spend on groceries in a day. I arrived 15 minutes early, partly from habit and partly because I wanted to see her walk in, to observe the person who had become the face of corporate indifference in my mind. The morning rush was winding down, leaving behind the kind of customers who had time for leisurely coffee meetings on Saturday mornings, People whose weekends weren't spent catching up on household chores and grocery, shopping with careful attention to every price tag. I recognized her immediately when she walked through the glass doors, though she looked different from the news photos. Smaller somehow, more tentative in her movements. She wore dark jeans and a simple sweater, civilian clothes that made her seem less formidable than the business attire I'd imagined during all those frustrating phone calls. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and I could see faint marks on her face where the oxygen mask had pressed against her skin during the rescue. She scanned the room with the careful attention of someone who wasn't entirely comfortable in unfamiliar situations. When our eyes met, she hesitated for just a moment before walking over to my table. Her handshake was firm, professional, but I noticed her fingers trembled slightly as she introduced herself. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, settling into the chair across from me with the practiced composure of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. "I know this is unusual, but I wanted to express my gratitude in person. You saved my life, and words don't seem adequate for something like that." I studied her face as she spoke, searching for signs of the callousness I'd attributed to her during those months of denied claims and rejected appeals. But what I saw was someone who looked tired, older than her 36 years, with the kind of stress lines around her eyes that come from carrying responsibilities that keep you awake at night. She ordered black coffee, no sugar, no cream, the choice of someone who viewed caffeine as fuel rather than pleasure. We made small talk for the first few minutes, the kind of polite conversation between strangers who share an unusual connection. She asked about my work, about how long I'd been with the fire department, about whether rescues like hers were common. I answered honestly but kept my responses brief, waiting for the right moment to reveal the connection she didn't know existed. Part of me wondered if she would even remember Danny's case among the hundreds of claims she must have reviewed, if our family's struggle had registered as anything more than routine paperwork in her daily workflow. The opening came when she mentioned her daughter, a casual reference to needing to pick up Emma from soccer practice later that afternoon. Something about the way she said it, the slight softening in her voice when she spoke her daughter's name, made me realize that Victoria Chun was more complicated than the villain I'd constructed in my imagination. She was someone's mother, juggling the same competing demands of work and parenthood that I knew so well, trying to balance professional obligations with the needs of a child who depended on her. That's when I decided to tell her who I really was, Miss Chun. I said, setting down my coffee cup with more force than necessary. "I need you to know something. My son Danny Rivera had his insurance claim denied by your company 3 months ago. Broken arm, emergency room visit, x-rays that your office deemed unnecessary. You signed the rejection letter yourself." The change in her expression was immediate and unmistakable. The professional politeness drained from her face, replaced by something that looked like recognition mixed with horror. Her coffee cup froze halfway to her lips, and I watched her mental wheels turning as she processed the implications of what I just told her. The man who had saved her life was the same man whose family she had financially devastated with a signature on a form. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I remember that case," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the coffee shop. "Rivera, Daniel, age 12, playground accident at school." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of coincidence and irony, with the awkwardness of two people realizing they were connected by circumstances neither of them could have predicted. "You denied coverage for my son's medical treatment," I continued, my voice steady but carrying the accumulated frustration of months of financial stress. "Do you remember why?" "Because according to your assessment, the x-rays were excessive for a simple fracture. Because the emergency room visit wasn't necessary, even though he was in excruciating pain and I didn't know how badly he was hurt. Because Saving your company a few $1,000s was more important than helping a kid who needed medical care. Victoria's face had gone pale, and I could see her struggling with the collision of her professional decisions and their human consequences. I approved that denial, she admitted, her voice carrying the weight of uncomfortable truth. The medical record suggested that urgent care would have been sufficient, that the emergency room was overkill for the type of injury described. We have protocols, guidelines that help us manage costs and prevent unnecessary procedures. But it wasn't overkill for us, I said, leaning forward slightly. Danny was scared and in pain, and I made the best decision I could with the information I had. I'm not a doctor, Miss Chun. I'm a firefighter and a father, and when my kid is hurt, I take him where I know he'll get help. Your protocols don't account for the fact that I was terrified something was seriously wrong, that I couldn't take the risk of waiting for urgent care to open or hoping that a 12-year-old could accurately describe his pain level. She listened without interrupting, and I could see something shifting in her expression as I continued. Those medical bills ate up our emergency fund, and then some. I worked double shifts for 2 months to pay them off, which meant less time with Danny when he needed me most. Your decision didn't just affect our finances, it affected our relationship, our daily life, our sense of security. But I suppose that's not something that shows up in your cost analysis reports. The accusation hung between us like smoke, and I watched Victoria struggle with the human impact of decisions she'd made from behind a desk, far removed from the families affected by her cost-cutting measures. I never considered, she began then. Stopped herself. I mean, we see so many claims, so many cases where the treatment seems excessive compared to the injury. It becomes a matter of pattern recognition, of applying consistent standards across thousands of files. But those aren't just files, I said, my voice rising slightly before I caught myself and lowered it again. Those are families, real people, dealing with real problems. Danny isn't a case number or a cost projection. He's a kid who loves baseball and struggles with math homework and still has nightmares sometimes about the day his mom died. When he got hurt, I didn't have the luxury of considering whether the emergency room was the most cost-effective option. I just needed someone to make sure my son was okay. Victoria stared down at her untouched coffee, and I could see her wrestling with the implications of our conversation. I want you to understand something, she said finally, her voice quieter than before. I have a daughter too. Emma is 14, and if she were hurt, I would probably make the same choices you made. I would take her to the emergency room, demand X-rays, insist on every test that might give me peace of mind about her condition. As a mother, I understand your decisions completely. Then why, I asked, did you deny our claim as a claims director? The question forced her to confront the disconnect between her personal understanding and her professional actions, between the empathy she felt as a parent and the cold calculations she applied to other people's emergencies. I could see the internal conflict playing out across her face as she struggled to reconcile these competing versions of herself. Because that's what the job requires, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Because insurance companies stay solvent by managing risk and controlling costs, by making difficult decisions that someone has to make. Because if we approved every claim without question, premiums would become unaffordable for everyone. She was reciting corporate talking points, but I could tell she was questioning them even as she spoke. The conversation that followed was unlike anything I'd expected when I'd agreed to meet her. Victoria told me about the pressure she faced in her position, about quotas for claim denials and cost savings that came from executives who never saw the human faces behind the case numbers. She described the weight of making decisions that affected families like mine, the sleepless nights when she wondered if she was becoming the kind of person she'd never intended to be. I found myself telling her about the months after Danny's accident, about the stress of juggling overtime shifts with single parenthood, about the way financial worry had invaded every aspect of our daily life. I told her about the conversations I'd had with Danny about money, about responsibility, about the difference between what we wanted and what we could afford. I described the guilt I felt for not being able to shield him from the adult world of insurance claims and medical bills, for having to explain why the system had failed us when he needed help. As we talked, something unexpected began to happen. The anger I'd carried for months started to transform into something more complex, a recognition that Victoria Chun was trapped in a system that demanded she make impossible choices between corporate profits and human needs. She wasn't the heartless bureaucrat I'd imagined, but someone struggling to balance professional obligations with personal ethics, someone who had perhaps lost sight of the human cost of her decisions until faced with their direct consequences. But understanding her position didn't eliminate the impact of her choices on my family. The bills were still paid, the stress was still endured. The relationship between Danny and me was still strained by months of financial uncertainty. Sympathy couldn't undo the damage her signature had caused, couldn't restore the sense of security. We'd lost when the system we'd trusted for protection had instead abandoned us in our moment of need. When she offered to review Danny's case, to see if there was any way to reverse the denial or provide retroactive coverage, I felt a mixture of hope and skepticism. Too little too late was my first thought, followed immediately by the recognition that any help would be meaningful, that pride was a luxury I couldn't afford when it came to my son's welfare. But I also wondered whether her offer was genuine remorse or simply guilt over the uncomfortable coincidence that had brought us together. The coffee shop had grown quieter around us as our conversation deepened, other customers coming and going while we remained locked in this unexpected confrontation with the consequences of bureaucratic decisions and human vulnerability. When Victoria finally checked her phone and realized she was late to pick up Emma from soccer practice, the spell was broken, and we both returned to the immediate demands of our parental responsibilities. The phone call came on Wednesday evening, while Danny and I were making tacos for dinner. Victoria's voice was different from our coffee shop conversation, more determined and less apologetic. She had news about Danny's case, she said, and wondered if we could meet again, this time with our children present. She wanted Emma to understand the real impact of the work her mother did, and she thought it might help both kids to see that adults could admit mistakes and work to fix them. I agreed, though I wasn't sure what to expect from a meeting that included our children. Danny had overheard enough of my phone conversations with insurance companies to understand that someone named Victoria Chun had made our lives difficult, but he didn't know the full story of how she'd become the person I'd saved from the fire. The irony still felt surreal to me, like something out of a movie where coincidences drive the plot forward in ways that real life rarely manages. We met at Laurelhurst Park on Saturday afternoon, choosing neutral ground where the kids could play while the adults navigated whatever conversation needed to happen. I spotted Victoria immediately, sitting on a bench near the playground with a teenage girl who had her mother's dark hair but carried herself with the casual confidence that comes from not yet understanding how complicated the world can be. Emma Chun was 14, tall for her age, wearing soccer cleats and still carrying the grass stains from what had obviously been morning practice. Danny stayed close to my side as we approached, his natural shyness amplified by the knowledge that this was the woman who had caused our family stress. At 12, he was old enough to understand that adults sometimes made decisions that hurt other people, but young enough to still believe that good people always tried to do the right thing. I could see him trying to reconcile the image of the heartless insurance executive with the ordinary-looking mother sitting on the park bench. Victoria stood as we approached, and I could see the nervousness in her posture, the way she smoothed her hands over her jeans as if preparing for a performance. "Emma," she said, turning to her daughter, "this is Marcus Rivera, the firefighter who saved my life last week. And this is his son, Danny." The introduction was simple, but I could hear the weight behind it, the unspoken complexity of our connection. Emma stepped forward with the easy social grace of a teenager who had been raised to be polite to adults, extending her hand to shake mine with surprising formality. "Thank you for saving my mom," she said, her voice carrying genuine gratitude. She told me what happened, about the fire and how you carried her down the ladder. I don't know what I would have done if something had happened to her. The honesty in her voice hit me unexpectedly hard, reminding me that every person I carried out of burning buildings was someone's entire world, someone's irreplaceable parent or partner or child. Emma's appreciation was uncomplicated by the insurance claim drama, pure in a way that made me remember why I became a firefighter in the first place. Not for recognition or gratitude, but because everyone deserves someone willing to run toward danger on their behalf. Danny stepped forward then, his curiosity overcoming his shyness as he looked up at Emma. "Are you really good at soccer?" he asked, nodding toward her cleats. "I play baseball, but I've always wondered if soccer is harder because you can't use your hands." The question broke the tension in a way that only children can manage, shifting the focus from adult complications to the simpler world of sports and shared interests. While the kids talked, Victoria and I walked a few steps away, maintaining visual contact with our children while creating space for the conversation we needed to have. She had good news, she told me, though her expression suggested the victory had come at a personal cost. Danny's claim had been reopened and approved, not just for the original medical expenses, but also for the follow-up visits and physical therapy that had been recommended but skipped due to cost concerns. The approval hadn't been easy to obtain. She explained. She'd had to challenge the original assessment, question the guidelines that had led to the denial, and ultimately put her own professional standing at risk by advocating for a case that had already been closed. Her supervisor had been less than pleased with her request to reverse a decision that fit perfectly within company policy, questioning her judgment and her understanding of cost management principles. But that wasn't all she had to tell me. The process of reviewing Danny's case had led her to examine other similar denials, other families who had been turned away when they needed help most. She'd found patterns that troubled her, cost-cutting measures that prioritized corporate profits over human welfare in ways that violated her personal ethics even if they aligned with company policy. The fire, she said, had done more than threaten her life. It had forced her to confront who she was becoming in her professional role. "I'm resigning from Meridian Insurance," she told me, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was announcing. "I can't continue making decisions that hurt families like yours. Can't keep signing denial letters for children who need medical care. I've accepted a position with a nonprofit that helps people navigate insurance claims, that advocates for patients instead of insurance companies. The pay is significantly less, but I'll be able to sleep at night." The decision had consequences. Beyond her career change, she continued. The salary reduction meant downsizing from their current house, changing Emma's school, adjusting to a lifestyle that prioritized purpose over profit margins. Emma had taken the news better than expected, especially after Victoria explained how her work had affected families like ours, how her mother wanted to help people instead of denying them assistance when they needed it most. As we talked, I watched Danny and Emma discover their shared love of strategy games, their conversation evolving from polite introductions to animated discussions about baseball statistics and soccer formations. Emma was explaining the offside rule with the patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed teaching, while Danny listened with the focused attention he usually reserved for topics that fascinated him. There was something natural about their interaction, the easy friendship that sometimes develops between children when adults aren't pushing too hard for connection. The afternoon stretched longer than either of us had planned, our conversation ranging from insurance, industry practices to single parenting challenges to the unexpected ways that traumatic events could catalyze positive change. Victoria told me about the nightmares she'd been having since the fire, Not about smoke and flames, but about all the families she'd failed to help over the years. All the children whose medical needs had been deemed unnecessary by corporate algorithms, designed to maximize profit margins. I found myself sharing my own struggles with guilt, the way I sometimes wondered if I was enough for Danny, if my love and attention could compensate for everything he'd lost when his mother died. Single parenting was a constant balancing act between protection and independence, between providing security and teaching resilience, between being present and allowing space for growth. Victoria understood these challenges in ways that most people couldn't, carrying the same weight of being someone's entire support system. When Emma suggested that she and Danny exchange contact information so they could continue their discussion about sports strategy, both Victoria and I recognized the significance of the gesture. Our children were choosing to maintain connection, despite the complicated history between their parents, creating a bridge between our families that had nothing to do with insurance claims or professional obligations. They were simply two kids who had found common ground and wanted to preserve the friendship they'd discovered. The weeks that followed our park meeting brought changes that none of us had anticipated. Victoria's transition to nonprofit work required long hours and steep learning curves, but she approached the challenges with energy I hadn't seen during our earlier conversations. She was working with families facing insurance denials, helping them understand their rights and navigate appeals processes that seemed designed to discourage persistence. The work was demanding but meaningful, each successful case representing a family that would be helped rather than abandoned by the system. Danny began looking forward to Emma's text messages about soccer games and school projects, their friendship developing through shared interests in books and movies, and the kind of random observations that teenagers find endlessly fascinating. Emma had appointed herself as Danny's unofficial big sister, offering advice about middle school social dynamics and helping him with homework subjects that challenged him. Their connection was genuine and uncomplicated, free from the adult world of professional obligations and past mistakes. Victoria and I developed our own friendship, built on mutual understanding of single-parent challenges and shared commitment to putting our children's needs first. We began meeting for coffee regularly, not at expensive Pearl District cafes, but at the neighborhood place near Danny's school, where conversations felt more natural and less formal. We talked about parenting strategies, work challenges, and the ongoing process of healing from the mistakes we'd made in our professional lives. The transformation in both our families was gradual but unmistakable. Victoria became more present in Emma's daily life, attending soccer games and helping with homework instead of managing her daughter's schedule from the office. She learned to prioritize family time over work obligations, to trust her parenting instincts instead of delegating emotional labor to hired help. Emma responded by sharing more about her thoughts and dreams, opening up about her fears and hopes, in ways that strengthened their relationship. Danny gained confidence from his friendship with Emma, becoming more outgoing at school and more willing to try new activities. He started playing soccer in addition to baseball, inspired by Emma's passion for the sport and encouraged by her patient coaching. The medical bills that had caused us so much stress were finally resolved, but more importantly, Danny had learned that adults could acknowledge mistakes and work to repair damage they had caused. 6 months after the Morrison building fire, Victoria invited Danny and me to Emma's soccer championship game. As we sat in the bleachers cheering for her team, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought our families together. The woman I had once seen as the embodiment of corporate indifference had become someone I trusted with my son's welfare. Someone whose friendship enriched both our lives in ways that had nothing to do with insurance claims or professional obligations. When Emma scored the winning goal and looked up at the bleachers to find her mother cheering with genuine joy rather than distracted attention, I understood that some rescues happen slowly, over time, through small acts of courage and vulnerability, rather than dramatic gestures in burning buildings. Victoria had saved herself by choosing purpose over profit, connection over control, presence over professional advancement. In doing so, she had taught both our children that adults could change, could admit mistakes, could choose to become better versions of themselves when faced with the consequences of their actions. The emergency call came during Emma's 15th birthday party, just as we were lighting the candles on the cake Victoria had spent all morning decorating. My pager buzzed insistently against my hip while Danny and Emma argued playfully about whether she should make a wish for her soccer team to win regionals or for her mother to finally learn how to parallel park. The sound cut through the laughter, filling Victoria's new apartment, smaller than her old penthouse but warmer somehow, filled with the comfortable chaos of teenagers and birthday decorations. I glanced at the display and felt my stomach drop. Structure fire, multiple victims reported. Address on Burnside Street, in one of the older neighborhoods where buildings sat too close together and fire spread fast. Victoria caught my expression. Immediately, recognizing the shift from off-duty father to emergency responder that she'd learned to read over the past year. "Go," she said simply, already moving to help me gather my keys and jacket. "We'll save you cake." Danny looked up from where he was helping Emma organize her gifts, understanding without words that duty was calling me away from yet another family moment. At 30 now, he'd grown accustomed to the unpredictable demands of my job, but I could see the familiar flicker of worry in his eyes, the fear that lived quietly in the back of his mind every time I walked into danger. Emma surprised me by crossing the room to give me a quick hug, something she'd started doing over the past few months, treating me with the casual affection reserved for family members rather than her mother's friend. "Be careful out there," she said, echoing the words Victoria used whenever I left for a particularly dangerous call. The simple phrase carried weight beyond its brevity, representing the investment our blended family had developed in each other's safety and well-being. These two kids had become central to my world in ways I never expected, their happiness intertwined with my own sense of purpose and belonging. The scene I arrived at 20 minutes later was worse than the initial report had suggested. A 3-story apartment building fully engulfed, flames shooting through every window, with residents gathered on the sidewalk in various states of dress and panic. Some held pets, others clutched photo albums or laptops, the random items people grab when they have seconds to decide what matters most. The building was old, the kind of structure that burned hot and fast, where every minute counted in terms of lives that might be saved or lost. Captain Rodriguez was coordinating the response, directing teams to different entry points while paramedics set up triage areas for smoke inhalation victims. The initial sweep had accounted for most residents, but reports were conflicting about whether everyone had made it out safely. Mrs. Patterson from the 2nd floor was insisting that her neighbor hadn't emerged, an elderly man named George who lived alone and might not have heard the smoke alarms over his television volume. I volunteered for the interior search without hesitation, the way I always did, but this time felt different somehow. As I checked my breathing apparatus and prepared to enter the building, I found myself thinking about the birthday party I'd left behind, about Danny's worried expression and Emma's casual hug goodbye. For the first time in my career, I felt the weight of having people who would be devastated if something happened to me, people whose lives had become intertwined with mine in ways that made my safety more than just a professional concern. The 2nd floor was a maze of smoke and heat, visibility near zero despite my flashlight and thermal imaging equipment. I called out for George repeatedly, listening for any response over the crackling of flames and the groaning of stressed building materials. The structure was compromising rapidly, and I knew my window for a safe exit was shrinking with each passing minute. Train and experience told me to retreat, to accept that some situations exceed the bounds of reasonable risk, but something kept me moving forward through the choking darkness. I found him in his bedroom, unconscious from smoke inhalation, wearing the kind of thick glasses that suggested he might not have seen the visual cues that would have alerted him to the fire's progression. George was probably in his 70s, thin and fragile-looking, wearing pajamas and slippers that spoke of someone who had been preparing for bed when disaster struck. He reminded me of my own grandfather, the man who had taught me that helping others was always worth the personal cost, that ordinary people became heroes by choosing courage over comfort when circumstances demanded it. Getting George down too. Flights of stairs while the building burned around us pushed my physical capabilities to their limits. He was conscious but disoriented, unable to help with his own evacuation, dead weight that I had to carry while navigating through smoke so thick it felt like swimming through tar. My breathing apparatus felt heavier than usual, and I could feel sweat pooling inside my protective gear as I concentrated on each step, each breath, each decision that might determine whether we both made it out alive. The stairwell collapsed. Just as we reached the first floor, timber and debris crashing down where we had been moments earlier. The sound was deafening, a reminder of how quickly buildings could transition from damaged to destroyed, how narrow the margin often was between successful rescue and tragic outcome. I radioed our position to the team outside, letting them know we needed immediate medical attention for George, and that the interior was no longer safe for any additional rescue attempts. The paramedics took over the moment we emerged, checking George's vitals and administering oxygen while I stood in the street trying to process what had just happened. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by the familiar mixture of relief and exhaustion that followed successful rescues. But something felt different this time, a heightened awareness of my own mortality that hadn't been present in previous emergencies. For the first time, I understood the fear that Danny lived with every time I went to work, the constant awareness that his only remaining parent walked into danger as a matter of professional routine. Captain Rodriguez clapped me on the shoulder as I walked toward the engine truck, his expression mixing pride with concern. "Good work in there, Rivera," he said, but I could hear the unspoken question in his voice, the wondering whether I was taking risks that exceeded reasonable bounds. "You seemed more focused than usual, more determined. Everything okay at home?" The question was casual, but I knew he was asking whether personal circumstances were affecting my professional judgment, whether the rescue had been motivated by appropriate tactical decisions or by something more complex. I assured him that everything was fine, that the rescue had proceeded according to standard protocols, but privately I wondered whether he was right to be concerned. Had I pushed further into the building because George needed help, or because I was trying to prove something to myself about courage and commitment? Had my decision-making been compromised by the emotional investment I developed in maintaining my role as protector and provider for the people who depended on me? These were questions without clear answers, complications that came with caring deeply about others in a profession that demanded objective risk assessment. The drive back to Victoria's apartment gave me time to decompress, to transition from emergency responder back to the man who would walk through her door and reassure two teenagers that their makeshift father figure had returned safely from another day of walking into burning buildings. I practiced the casual confidence that would mask my own shaken nerves, the performance of invulnerability that parents maintain to protect their children from unnecessary worry about dangers they cannot control. When I knocked on Victoria's door, still smelling of smoke despite the shower I'd taken at the station, Emma opened it immediately, as if she'd been waiting by the window for my return. Her relief was visible and immediate, the kind of genuine emotion that reminded me how much our relationship had evolved over the past year. She had become protective of me in the way that children protect adults they've claimed as family, worried about my safety in ways that went beyond polite concern for her mother's friend. Danny appeared behind her, trying to maintain the casual demeanor that 13-year-old boys used to mask deep emotions, but I could see the tension leaving his shoulders as he confirmed that I was whole and unhurt. Victoria emerged from the kitchen carrying a plate of birthday cake, her eyes scanning my face for signs of trauma or injury, reading the micro-expressions that revealed more than my words about how the call had affected me. She had learned to interpret the subtle indicators that distinguished routine emergencies from the calls that left lasting impressions, the rescues that reminded me why my job mattered and why it carried such significant personal costs. We ate cake in the living room while I told them about George, about the successful rescue and the building collapse that had made the evening more dramatic than usual. I kept the details appropriate for teenage audiences, emphasizing the positive outcome rather than the moments when survival had felt uncertain. But Victoria understood the subtext, recognized the slight tremor in my hands that suggested the night had been more challenging than my narrative indicated. After Danny and Emma had returned to cleaning up birthday party debris, Victoria pulled me aside for the kind of private conversation that had become routine after difficult calls. She could tell that something about the rescue had affected me differently, that the usual post-emergency processing was more complex than normal. Her transition from insurance executive to nonprofit advocate had taught her to read people more carefully, to recognize when someone was struggling with burdens they couldn't easily articulate. "You seemed different when you came back tonight," she observed, settling beside me on the couch while the kids argued about movie choices in the next room. "More shaken than usual, like something about this call got to you in a way that others don't." She wasn't prying, exactly, but offering the kind of supportive space that allowed difficult conversations to develop naturally, without pressure or judgment. I found myself telling her about the moment in the stairwell when I'd realized how much I had to lose now, how the presence of people who depended on me had changed my relationship with professional risk. For years, my job had been about helping others with relatively little personal investment in the outcome, beyond professional pride and basic human compassion. But now Danny and Emma's welfare was tied to my safety. Their security depended on my ability to make smart decisions under pressure and return home each night to fulfill my role in their lives. Victoria listened without offering immediate solutions or reassurances, understanding that some fears needed to be acknowledged rather than dismissed. She had faced similar reckonings in her own career transition, moments when the gap between professional obligations and personal values had forced difficult choices about priorities and identity. Her decision to leave insurance work had been motivated partly by the recognition that she couldn't continue making decisions that contradicted her values as a mother and human being. The conversation that followed explored the complex territory of loving people enough to risk everything for them while also loving them enough to stay safe for their sake. We talked about the balance between courage and recklessness, between serving others and serving the people who needed us most. Victoria shared her own struggles with this balance, the ways her work as a patient advocate sometimes required her to take professional risks that could affect her ability to provide. For Emma, the constant tension between individual cases and long-term stability. As the evening wore down and the kids settled into their respective bedrooms, Victoria and I found ourselves planning the kind of future that neither of us had expected when we'd first met in that Pearl District coffee shop. Not a romantic future, exactly, but something deeper and more complex. A chosen family built on mutual support and shared commitment to the children who had brought us together. We were creating something that looked nothing like traditional family structures, but felt exactly like home to all of us. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, official letterhead from the Portland Fire Department, announcing the annual Valor Awards ceremony. My name was listed among the recipients. Recognition for the George Morrison rescue and several other calls over the past year where outcomes had exceeded expectations. Danny found the envelope first, tearing it open with the excitement that mail still generated for 13-year-olds, his voice carrying through our apartment as he read aloud about his father being honored for bravery and service to the community. Victoria was making coffee in our kitchen when Danny burst through the door with the news. her morning routine having evolved to include checking on us before heading to her nonprofit office. Over the past 18 months, the boundaries between our two households had blurred until we functioned more like an extended family than separate units sharing occasional dinners. Emma often did homework at our kitchen table while Danny helped. Victoria prepared meals that had grown larger to accommodate 4 people instead of 2. The award ceremony was scheduled for the following month, a formal dinner where families would gather to celebrate the firefighters, paramedics, and police officers who had distinguished themselves through exceptional service. Danny immediately began planning what he would wear, treating the occasion with the seriousness of someone who understood that his father's recognition reflected not just individual achievement, but validation of the values we had tried to instill about helping others and standing up for people who needed protection. Emma's reaction was equally enthusiastic, though expressed through the casual pride that teenagers use to mask deep emotions. She had taken ownership of my success in ways that surprised me, bragging to her friends about her honorary stepfather, who ran into burning buildings and saved people's lives. The designation was her own creation, a way of claiming our relationship publicly without the legal formalities that didn't quite capture the complexity of our blended family structure. Victoria's pride was quieter but no less meaningful, expressed through the careful attention she paid to Danny's excitement, and the way she immediately began coordinating schedules to ensure that both kids could attend the ceremony. Her transformation from corporate executive to nonprofit advocate had included learning to celebrate victories that weren't measured in quarterly earnings or stock prices, finding satisfaction in outcomes that improved lives rather than balance sheets. The weeks leading up to the ceremony were filled with preparation that went beyond selecting formal attire. Danny decided he wanted to invite his baseball coach and his favorite teacher, expanding the guest list to include the extended community that had supported him through the challenges of growing up with a single father whose job carried constant risks. Emma appointed herself as event coordinator, handling logistics with the efficiency she had inherited from her mother, but applying it to family celebrations rather than corporate meetings. Victoria used the occasion to reflect on the journey that had brought us together, the unlikely series of events that had transformed her from the person who had denied Danny's insurance claim to someone who would now fight fiercely to protect his interests. She had been working particularly hard on a case involving a family whose child needed specialized medical equipment, insurance coverage that was being delayed by bureaucratic obstacles designed to discourage persistence. The parallels to our own experience were obvious, but her approach now came from understanding rather than policy adherence. The ceremony itself exceeded all our expectations, held in a downtown hotel ballroom decorated with flags and filled with families celebrating their heroes. Danny wore his first real suit, purchased specifically for the occasion, while Emma chose a dress that struck the perfect balance between formal and age-appropriate. Victoria had selected an outfit that reflected her new professional identity, elegant but understated, appropriate for someone whose work now focused on service rather than self-promotion. When my name was called, I walked to the podium accompanied by applause from colleagues and family members, but my eyes were drawn to the table where Danny, Emma, and Victoria sat together. Danny's face glowed with pride so pure it was almost painful to witness, while Emma recorded everything on her phone with the dedicated focus she usually reserved for soccer games. Victoria watched with the expression of someone who understood that this recognition represented more than individual achievement, that it validated the values we had been teaching our children about courage, service, and the importance of showing up for people who needed help. The citation read aloud by Chief Martinez detailed the Morrison rescue and several other calls where my actions had resulted in lives saved, but the words felt abstract compared to the immediate reality of seeing my family in the audience. These 3 people had become my motivation for maintaining the balance between professional courage and personal responsibility, for making smart decisions under pressure that would allow me to continue serving the community, while also being present for the people who depended on me at home. Danny's reaction when I returned to the table was everything I could have hoped for from years of trying to model integrity and service. He hugged me with the fierce affection that 13-year-old boys reserve for moments when social expectations permit emotional expression, whispering that he was proud to be my son loud enough for surrounding tables to hear. Emma joined the embrace with characteristic enthusiasm, publicly claiming our family connection in ways that would have seemed impossible during our awkward first meeting at Laurelhurst Park. Victoria's congratulations were quieter but equally meaningful, conveyed through the kind of look that passes between adults who have watched each other grow and change in fundamental ways. She understood better than anyone how far I had traveled from the angry father sitting in that Pearl District coffee shop, demanding answers about denied insurance claims. The man receiving recognition tonight was still committed to fighting for people who needed help, but the motivation now came from abundance rather than desperation, from having experienced the support of community rather than the isolation of struggling alone. The reception following the ceremony provided opportunities for our children to meet other firefighter families, to understand that they were part of a larger community of people who understood the unique challenges and rewards of loving someone whose job involved running toward danger. Danny connected with other kids who shared his mixture of pride and worry about their parents' dangerous work, while Emma appointed herself as photographer for the evening, documenting moments that she declared worthy of framing. One conversation during the reception particularly stood out when Chief Martinez pulled me aside to discuss my future with the department. He had been watching my development over the past 2 years, noting not just my technical skills and rescue successes but also my evolution as a mentor to younger firefighters and my increasing involvement in community outreach programs. There was an opening for a training position, he explained. Work that would keep me primarily at the station, while still utilizing my field experience to prepare others for emergency response. The position offered better hours, reduced physical risk, and the opportunity to influence the next generation of first responders, while maintaining connection to the work that had defined my adult life. It also meant more time at home with Danny and Emma, more availability for school events and family dinners, more presence in their daily lives during the crucial years when they would be making decisions about their own futures and values. I asked for time to consider the offer, wanting to discuss the implications with Victoria and the kids before making a decision that would affect all our lives. The conversation that followed over the next few days revealed the depth of consideration each family member had given to the balance between my professional calling and our collective needs. Danny admitted that he worried about me during every shift, that the anxiety had become manageable but never disappeared entirely. Emma confessed that she had been researching firefighter injury statistics, trying to understand the mathematical probability of something happening to me. Victoria's perspective was characteristically thoughtful, acknowledging both the value of my field work and the appeal of a position that would provide more stability for our family unit. She had learned through her own career transition that sometimes the most meaningful work required accepting different forms of contribution, that serving others could take many shapes depending on life circumstances and competing obligations. The decision ultimately felt inevitable once we had discussed all the factors involved. I accepted the training position, transitioning from active emergency response to preparing others for the challenges I had navigated successfully for years. The change felt like natural evolution rather than retreat, an acknowledgement that my priorities had expanded beyond individual heroics to include the longer-term project of raising children who would contribute positively to their communities. Danny's relief was immediate and obvious, though he tried to maintain the stoic demeanor he thought appropriate for supporting his father's dangerous career. Emma's reaction was more complex, mixing happiness about my increased safety with concern. that I might miss the excitement and validation of rescue work. Victoria understood the transition better than anyone, having experienced her own version of choosing family welfare over professional identity, values over advancement, presence over prestige. The months that followed brought adjustments that none of us had fully anticipated. My new schedule meant being available for Danny's baseball games and Emma's soccer matches, school conferences and family dinners, the daily routines that had previously been interrupted by emergency calls. I discovered aspects of parenthood that had been compressed into evenings and weekends, the ongoing negotiations and conversations that shaped children's development between dramatic moments and major decisions. Training new firefighters provided different satisfactions than direct rescue work, the reward of watching young men and women develop skills and confidence that would serve them throughout their careers. I found myself emphasizing not just technical competence, but also the importance of understanding community service as a calling that extended beyond individual glory to collective responsibility for protecting and supporting vulnerable populations. Victoria's work at the nonprofit had evolved to include policy advocacy, using her corporate background to navigate legislative processes that could improve healthcare access for low-income families. She had discovered that her years in the insurance industry, despite the ethical compromises they had required, provided valuable insight into system failures that needed addressing. Her inside knowledge of cost-cutting strategies and claim denial protocols made her particularly effective at developing counter-strategies that protected patient rights. Emma's development over this period was remarkable to witness. Her natural leadership abilities, channeled into student government and community service projects that reflected the values we had been modeling about standing up for people who needed help. She organized food drives and volunteer programs with the same efficiency her mother brought to policy advocacy, demonstrating that concern for others could be expressed through many different forms of action and commitment. Danny's growth was equally impressive, though expressed through quieter confidence and increased willingness to try new challenges. His friendship with Emma had taught him that age differences could enhance rather than complicate relationships. When both people brought genuine care and respect to their interactions, he had begun tutoring younger students at school, discovering his own capacity for patience and encouragement when helping others succeed. The anniversary of the Morrison Building fire arrived without fanfare, marked only by a brief mention in local news coverage of fire safety improvements implemented since the incident. But for our family, the date represented the beginning of a journey that had transformed all our lives in ways we never could have predicted. Victoria and I had evolved from adversaries to partners in the complex project of raising children who understood both individual responsibility and collective obligation. 2 years after that first awkward coffee shop meeting, we found ourselves hosting Danny's 14th birthday party in the backyard of the house we had purchased together, a modest place that provided space for both families while maintaining the financial responsibility that came with prioritizing values over status symbols. The guest list included teammates from both kids' sports, classmates from school, neighbors who had become friends, and colleagues from both our workplaces who had been incorporated into our chosen family structure. Watching Danny and Emma coordinate party activities with practiced teamwork, seeing Victoria laugh at jokes told by teenage boys, feeling the satisfaction of providing stability and joy for people I loved completely, I understood that some rescues happen gradually through daily choices to show up and stay present rather than dramatic gestures in emergency situations. We had all saved each other in different ways, creating something that looked nothing like conventional family structures, but felt exactly like home. The birthday cake that year featured both baseball and soccer decorations, representing the interests that had helped Danny and Emma bond while acknowledging their individual passions and talents. As we sang together and watched Danny make his wishes, I reflected on how much had changed since the morning I had carried an unconscious woman down a ladder from a burning building. never imagining that she would become central to my son's happiness and my own sense of belonging. Victoria caught my eye across the crowded backyard, sharing the kind of look that passes between people who have witnessed each other's transformation and growth. We had built something unprecedented in both our lives, a family defined not by blood or legal documents, but by daily choice and mutual commitment, by the decision to keep showing up for each other's joys and struggles, regardless of convenience or social expectations. The future stretched ahead of us, full of possibilities we were still discovering, challenges we would face together, celebrations we would share, and the ongoing project of raising children who would carry forward the values we had learned through our own mistakes and victories. Some families are born, others are made, and the very best ones are chosen daily through small acts of love and larger acts of courage, by people brave enough to believe that everyone deserves to be seen, valued, and included in the dance of belonging. That makes life meaningful. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.